I'm Ethan Caldwell, and this is Blackthorn Haven, a 60-acre plot on the outskirts of Oregon, my fortress, where I own every brick, every inch of soil. It's been in my family for generations, ever since my great-grandfather laid the first granite stones to build the main house, raised high fences, and forged sturdy iron gates. I never imagined that one day I'd get tangled in a battle with a real-life Karen. But life sometimes likes to throw curveballs no one sees coming. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the latest video. Blackthorn Haven is my home, a place set apart from the clamor of the city. I grew up listening to my dad tell stories about my great-grandfather, how he turned this wild land into an impregnable refuge. When Dad passed, I left Portland, where I'd worked as an engineer, to come back here. I walked the property every day, checking the fences, gazing at the pine forest, and soaking in the quiet. That's all I want. A place where no one can impose their rules on me. A few years ago, a new neighborhood popped up near my land, Pineview Heights they call it. Identical houses, perfectly manicured lawns, and a homeowners association that loves controlling everything. I didn't pay it much mind back then. Live and let live, I told myself. As long as they stayed on their side of the road, and didn't cross my boundary, we'd have no trouble. One morning, while I was walking the property, inspecting the fences and watching the pine trees sway in the breeze, I heard a shrill voice call out from behind. Hey, you there. I turned around and saw a woman in her mid-40s striding toward me, her short blonde hair bouncing with each determined step. She wore yoga pants, a fleece jacket, and clutched a tablet like it was a Bible. I tried to keep my voice calm, though I didn't much care for strangers showing up on my land uninvited. Can I help you? I asked, arms crossed, my tone dipping low. She stopped in front of me, slightly out of breath from her brisk pace. Hi, I'm Margaret Reynolds, president of the Pineview Heights Homeowners Association, she said, extending her hand with an overconfident air. I shook it reluctantly, replying curtly, Ethan Caldwell. She nodded, then started tapping on her tablet like she was checking a list. Mr. Caldwell, I'm glad to meet you. We need to discuss some serious violations here per our community guidelines. I blinked, caught off guard, my mind reeling trying to figure out what she meant. Sorry, what are you talking about? I asked, forcing myself to stay calm. Margaret tapped harder on her tablet, pulling up some kind of list. First off, your grass is overgrown beyond reason. Our rules state it can't exceed 3 inches. And don't get me started on those trees. We have strict pruning regulations. I held up a hand, cutting her off. Hold on a second, ma'am. I think there's a misunderstanding. I'm not part of your homeowners association. She looked at me like I just said the sun was purple. Don't be ridiculous. Of course you are. Every resident in Pineview Heights is automatically a member. I took a deep breath, keeping my voice firm. Maybe so, but I don't live in Pineview Heights. This is Blackthorn Haven, my private property, and I own every brick here. Things kicked off a few days after that first encounter. I was inside, sitting in my dad's old armchair, reading a book and listening to the wind rustle through the pines outside the window. It was a peaceful day, the kind I loved at Blackthorn Haven. No noise, no hassle. But then I heard an engine in the distance, an unfamiliar sound on the dirt road leading to my property. I got up, peered out the window, and saw a shiny white SUV parked right up against my fence. Margaret stepped out, still clutching that tablet to her chest, wearing a different workout outfit, but this time with a baseball cap that didn't suit her one bit. I sighed, knowing my peace was about to shatter. I stepped outside, slamming the door shut so she'd know she wasn't welcome. As I approached the fence, Margaret was already there, tapping away on her tablet like a judge about to pass sentence. Mr. Caldwell, she chirped, her voice as high-pitched as before. I've been thinking about what we discussed the other day, and I'm afraid you don't grasp the importance of community upkeep. I crossed my arms, locking eyes with her. I told you already, Margaret. I'm not part of your community. This is Blackthorn Haven, my private land. You've got no say here. She smirked, that smug little grin that made me want to turn and walk away. Don't be so stubborn, Mr. Caldwell. I can see your house from Pineview Heights. It's clearly within our sphere of influence. And if you won't follow the rules, the least you could do is respect your neighbors. I let out a laugh, unable to hold it in. Sphere of influence? Are you kidding me? This is my fortress, not Pineview Heights' backyard. And I own every brick here, not you or your association. Margaret narrowed her eyes, clearly not fond of being challenged. She held up her tablet, pointing to something on the screen. Say what you will, but I've documented a slew of issues. Your fence is too rundown. Our rules require regular maintenance. Then there's that barn, looking like it's about to collapse, ruining the community aesthetic. And the pine forest, it needs clearing. A proper trim. I cut her off, my voice sharper. Margaret, listen close. This is my land, not Pineview Heights. You don't get to tell me what to do with my fence, my barn, or my trees. Now please leave, before I lose my patience. She stood still, clutching her tablet like a shield. Mr. Caldwell, I don't appreciate threats, she said, her voice trembling, but still clinging to arrogance. I'm not going anywhere until we sort this out. I represent Pineview Heights, and we have a right to ensure everything in this area meets standards. I shook my head, almost in disbelief at her audacity. Represent whatever you want. But here, on Blackthorn Haven, you're nothing. This is private property, and your rules don't apply. Margaret took a long breath, her face flushing with anger. We'll see about that, she snapped, then pulled out her phone, typing furiously. I'll call the police. They'll sort this out. I shrugged, unfazed. Go right ahead. I've got nothing to hide. She shot me one last glare, then marched back to her SUV, striding off with the air of someone who'd lost a hand, but was still grasping for pride. As her car disappeared, I stood there, watching, knowing this trouble from Pineview Heights was just getting started. Just a few days later, she was back, and this time she brought a whole circus to test my patience. I was near the barn, fixing some weathered planks I planned to keep rough. I liked how time left its mark on Blackthorn Haven. Birds chirped, the wind whispered through the pines, and I was savoring the calm when I heard an odd sound, a faint buzz, like an insect, but steady and mechanical. I looked up, scanning around, and then spotted it, a tiny drone hovering over my land, just above the fence. I squinted, watching it glide over the pasture, then loop back toward the main house. Right away, I knew who was behind it. I dropped my hammer, strode quickly to the iron gate, and sure enough there was Margaret standing a few yards from the fence, holding a controller, eyes glued to her phone screen. She wore a different fleece jacket, still clutching that damn tablet like it was her lifeline. I swung the gate open, marched straight toward her, my voice cutting through before she could look up. Margaret, what the hell are you doing with a drone over my land? She flinched, nearly dropping her phone, but quickly regained her composure. Oh, Mr. Caldwell, I'm just doing a little inspection, she said, her tone dripping with fake sweetness. Inspection? I repeated, crossing my arms, planting myself between her and the fence. You've got no right to fly that thing over Blackthorn Haven. This is private property, and I've made that clear. Margaret smirked again, that irritating little twist of her lips that made me want to walk away. Don't be so sensitive, Mr. Caldwell. I need to document evidence of your property's condition. It's clearly dragging down Pineview Heights' value. Run-down fence, overgrown trees, not to mention that barn looking like a pile of rubble. Our homeowners association takes this very seriously. I took a deep breath, fighting to stay calm, but my voice turned steely. Margaret, listen, this is my fortress, not an extension of Pineview Heights. I own every brick, every pine, every plank here. You don't get to trespass, drone or otherwise. She narrowed her eyes, stepping closer, tablet raised like a weapon. Say what you want, but I can see your house from our side. You're part of this community, whether you admit it or not, and I won't let you tank everyone's property values with your wild lifestyle. I laughed, couldn't help it. Your community. I didn't sign anything with Pineview Heights, and Blackthorn Haven was here long before your neighborhood existed. Now turn off that drone and get out of here before I call the cops for trespassing. Margaret froze, her face reddening with fury. You don't scare me, Mr. Caldwell, she snapped. I'm acting for the greater good. If you won't cooperate, I'll report this to local authorities. They'll settle it. Go ahead, I said, shrugging, not a bit worried. Call them. I've got nothing to hide, and the law's on my side. This is private land, Margaret. You've got no authority here. She stared at me, gripping the drone controller so hard her knuckles went white. We'll see about that, she said, her voice shaky but still clinging to arrogance. She tapped something on her phone, then turned back to her SUV, throwing me one last defiant glance as she left. I knew she wouldn't stop at empty threats. I told her straight up that this was my fortress, that she had no authority here. But clearly Margaret wasn't the type to back down from a few stern words. I started keeping a closer eye on the fence, checking the iron gate daily, because my gut told me the trouble from Pineview Heights was about to push past what I could tolerate. It all blew up one afternoon, while I was near the pond, quietly watching fish swim under the fading sunlight. I heard an engine in the distance, not the usual car sound, but something heavier, mechanical, lawnmowers, the clank of metal chains. I frowned, stood up, and hurried toward the western fence, where it bordered the road to Pineview Heights. When I got there, I could hardly believe my eyes. A landscaping crew, 3 men in green uniforms, armed with mowers and chainsaws, was bustling onto my land, just inside the fence. They'd already cut a 10-meter strip of grass, and one guy was raising a saw toward a small pine I'd planted years ago. "Hey!" I shouted, striding across the pasture, fists clenched. "What the hell are you doing on my land?" The crew paused, glancing at each other in confusion. One of them, apparently the leader, stepped forward, holding a clipboard. "Hi there," he said, voice hesitant. "We were hired to do landscaping here. Mrs. Reynolds from Pineview Heights told us to bring this place up to community standards." My blood boiled. Community standards? This is Blackthorn Haven, my private property. Who gave you permission to come in here? Before he could answer, I heard tires crunching on the road. Margaret's white SUV pulled up near the fence, and she stepped out, tablet clutched to her chest, flashing a triumphant smile. "Mr. Caldwell," she called, her tone sugary, but defiant. "I see you're admiring my team's work. Don't worry, we'll make this place look proper." I turned to her, stepping over the fence to face her head on. "Margaret, what the hell are you doing? You have no right to send people onto my land. This is trespassing." She waved a hand, acting unbothered. "Oh, don't blow it out of proportion. Mr. Caldwell, I'm just helping you. Your land looks like a wasteland, and it's dragging down Pineview Heights' value. You should be thanking me." I was nearly speechless at her gall. "Thank you for trespassing and wrecking my property. This is my fortress, Margaret. I own every brick, every blade of grass here, and you've got no right to touch a thing." Margaret crossed her arms, her smile fading. "Listen, Mr. Caldwell, I've been patient with you long enough. It's time you fall in line like everyone else in this community. I represent Pineview Heights, and I won't let you embarrass the area with your reckless lifestyle." I took a deep breath, keeping my voice calm but firm. "Margaret, I'll say this one last time. I'm not part of your community. This is private land, and you and your crew are trespassing. If you don't leave now, I'm calling the cops." She narrowed her eyes, stepping closer, her voice dropping with menace. "Go ahead and call. I have paperwork proving this land falls under Pineview Heights jurisdiction. You think you can fight our homeowners association?" I locked eyes with her, unflinching. "I don't care what paperwork you've got. This is Blackthorn Haven, and the law protects me. Now tell your crew to get the hell out." Margaret stood still for a moment, then turned to the landscapers. "Keep going," she ordered, her tone icy. "We'll sort this out later." That was the last straw. I pulled out my phone and dialed Liam Carter, my best friend from high school, now a local police officer. "Liam, I need you at Blackthorn Haven now," I said, voice low and tight. "I've got trespassers, and I need this handled." While waiting for Liam, I stood in front of the crew, blocking them from moving another inch. Margaret glared at me, her face red with fury, but I didn't care. She could bring the whole world here. I wasn't backing down. About 20 minutes later, Liam's patrol car rolled up the dirt road. He stepped out, flashing me that familiar grin. "Hey Ethan," he called. "What's the trouble now?" Before I could speak, Margaret charged forward, voice shrill. "Officer, I want to report him for refusing to comply with Pineview Heights community rules." Liam raised an eyebrow, glancing at me. I shrugged. "She sent people onto my land, Liam. This is Blackthorn Haven, not Pineview Heights." Liam nodded, turning to Margaret. "Ma'am, I know Ethan's property well. It's not part of Pineview Heights. You're trespassing on private land. Now pull your crew back, or I'll have to write you up." Margaret's jaw dropped, but she finally signaled the crew to retreat. As she climbed into her SUV, she shot me a venomous look. "This isn't over," she hissed. I stood there, watching her drive off, knowing my fortress had just won a small battle. She went quiet for a few days, long enough for me to think I might get back to my peaceful life, fixing fences and gazing at the pines without worry. But then I realized that silence was just the calm before a smarter, sneakier attack, and this time she wasn't coming with chainsaws but with paperwork. It started when I checked the mailbox by the iron gate, an old rusty thing I rarely opened since no one sent me anything but bills. Inside was a thick envelope from the county office, stamped in bold red. I tore it open, and my blood ran cold at the first line. Property inspection notice, suspected violations of building and maintenance codes. The letter claimed an anonymous complaint had been filed about unpermitted structures and substandard land conditions at Blackthorn Haven. They demanded I provide ownership documents and allow an inspection within a week. I didn't need to guess who was behind it. Margaret's fingerprints were all over the pretentious wording. I stormed back into the house, tossing the letter onto the kitchen table, and sat down, fists clenched. This wasn't just harassment anymore. She was trying to use the system to break me, to turn my fortress into something she could control. I grabbed my phone, about to call Liam, but stopped. I needed more than a cop this time. I needed someone who could beat Margaret at her own game. I dug through my contacts and found Olivia Harper, a lawyer I'd met in Portland, known for handling property disputes. I called her right away, and after a quick greeting, I cut to the chase. Olivia, I need you to help me protect Blackthorn Haven. Someone's hitting me with fake paperwork, and I'm not letting them win. While waiting for Olivia, I kept a closer watch on Margaret. I saw her white SUV cruising by the road near my fence, slow like she was scouting. Once I caught her parked, leaning out her window with her phone up, obviously, snapping pictures of my land. I stepped out, yelling across the fence. Margaret, what are you doing with that phone? She flinched but quickly regained her swagger. Just enjoying the view, Mr. Caldwell, she said, voice dripping with fake charm. I crossed my arms, staring her down. Enjoying the view by photographing my land. What are you collecting for your next little game? She smirked, that familiar twist of her lips I'd come to know too well. If you must know, I'm documenting your ongoing violations. The Homeowners Association is very concerned, and I'll make sure this gets handled properly. I shook my head, voice hardening. Margaret, we've been over this. I'm not part of your association. This is Blackthorn Haven, my fortress, and I own every brick here. Stop this harassment, or I'll report you to the police. She laughed, like I'd told a joke. Go ahead, Mr. Caldwell. I'm not doing anything wrong. Then she hit the gas, her SUV speeding off, leaving me standing there with anger boiling inside. Olivia arrived at Blackthorn Haven the next day, lugging a briefcase full of papers and a sharp-eyed look that said she wasn't afraid to fight. I handed her the county letter, and recounted everything, from Margaret's first visit to the landscaping crew. Olivia read it, nodding. She's playing dirty legal games, she said. But I'll check if this complaint's even legit. She might have faked something to pressure you. I led Olivia to the small office in the house, pulling out a thick stack of files, deeds, land maps, building permits from my great-grandfather's time. This is everything I've got, I said. Blackthorn Haven's legally protected, and I want her to know it. Olivia got to work, contacting the county to verify. Meanwhile, I decided to dig into Margaret and Pineview Heights. I drove through their neighborhood, just to scope it out, and ran into Helen, an older woman living at the end of the street. She told me how Margaret fined her thousands for keeping cats in her yard, even though the rules weren't clear. Then I met Tom, a single dad hassled daily by Margaret for parking his work truck out front. She's a nightmare, Tom said, voice thick with frustration. But no one fights back because she's got the whole association behind her. Those stories lit a fire in me. This wasn't just my fight anymore. Margaret was bullying an entire community, and I was her biggest target. When Olivia called back, she confirmed my suspicions. The complaint's fake, she said. There's no record of it at the county office. She's bluffing you, Ethan, and maybe the authorities too. I nodded, resolve surging through me. Then we hit back, I said. I want her to pay for daring to attack Blackthorn Haven. I told Olivia to prepare papers to sue Margaret and the Pineview Heights HOA for harassment and defamation. I installed cameras around the fence, capturing every time Margaret drove by, building evidence if she kept it up. I thought I was ready for her next move, but I didn't expect her to be bold enough to sabotage my fortress right under my nose. It all came crashing down one early morning as the sun peeked through the pines. I woke to an odd noise. Not the familiar wind or birdsong, but a mechanical roar and the splintering of wood. I bolted up, threw on a jacket, and ran outside. When I reached the south fence where it bordered Pineview Heights, I nearly froze. A small construction crew, 5 guys in reflective vests, was tearing down a section of my fence with chainsaws and sledgehammers. They'd felled an ancient pine nearby, one my great-grandfather planted that I'd always seen as the soul of Blackthorn Haven. Grass was torn up, soil gouged, and one guy was raising a saw to the next tree. Hey, I yelled, charging across the pasture, heart pounding with rage. Stop right now. What the hell are you doing on my land? The crew paused, exchanging uneasy glances. One, apparently the foreman, stepped forward, clipboard in hand. Hi, he said, voice faltering. We were hired by Mrs. Reynolds to renovate this area. She said the landowner agreed to comply with Pineview Heights community standards. I clenched my jaw, blood rushing to my head. Agreed. I never agreed to anything. This is Blackthorn Haven, my private property, and you're destroying it. Before he could respond, I heard the familiar crunch of tires. Margaret's white SUV pulled up near the gate, and she stepped out, smirking triumphantly. tablet in hand as always. "Mr. Caldwell," she called, her tone sugary but defiant. "I see you're admiring the renovation. Don't worry, we'll turn this into a proud part of Pineview Heights." I spun toward her, striding over, fist balled. "Margaret, what are you doing? You've got no right to send people to tear down my fence and cut my trees. This is trespassing, and I won't stand for it." She waved a hand, brushing me off. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Mr. Caldwell. I'm just helping you bring this land up to code. That rickety fence is a hazard, and those pines are too overgrown. We need to clean up to protect community value." I was nearly speechless at her nerve. "Help me, by wrecking Blackthorn Haven. This is my fortress, Margaret. I own every brick, every tree here, and you're breaking the law." Margaret crossed her arms, her smile fading. "Mr. Caldwell, I've told you. It's time you fall in line with everyone at Pineview Heights. I have paperwork proving this land falls under our jurisdiction." She pulled a stack of documents from her bag, holding them up. I snatched them, flipping through, eyes widening at the contents. Forged maps, doctored permits, all trying to claim Blackthorn Haven as part of Pineview Heights. "This is fake," I growled, tossing the papers to the ground. "You forged documents to attack me." She smirked, unfazed. "Prove it," she said, voice dripping with challenge. That was it. I pulled out my phone and dialed Liam Carter. "Liam, I need you at Blackthorn Haven now," I said, voice shaking with fury. "Margaret's vandalizing my land, with a construction crew, and fake papers. Bring someone good with property crimes." I turned to the crew. "Stop now, or I'll sue every one of you." They hesitated, then lowered their tools, clearly not wanting deeper trouble. Margaret stood there, paling as I called the police, but still clinging to her arrogance. "Call whoever you want, Mr. Caldwell. I'm within my rights." I stepped close, voice low and dangerous. "You've got no right to touch a single brick here. This is Blackthorn Haven, and I'll defend it to the end." She shouted at the crew, "Pull out, we'll come back later." But I blocked their path. "No, you stay until the cops get here." About half an hour later, Liam rolled up with a detective, a tall guy named Dan, who specialized in property crimes. I laid it all out, showing them the fake papers, and the wrecked fence. Liam shook his head, turning to Margaret. "Miss Reynolds, you're trespassing on private property, and possibly tied to fraud. Hands out." Her jaw dropped, stammering. "This is for the community. He's devaluing the area." But Dan had the cuffs ready, and before she could resist, she was led to the patrol car, still yelling about community standards, as the door slammed shut. As the police drove off, I stood amid the wreckage, broken fence, felled pine, torn up ground. I knelt, touching the stump of my great-grandfather's tree, a pang in my chest. But resolve surged too. Margaret had crossed the line and I wouldn't let her off easy. Blackthorn Haven was my fortress, and I'd make her pay for daring to ruin it. She'd vandalized Blackthorn Haven, used fake papers to attack me, but I wasn't letting this slide. I had Olivia Harper, camera footage, and statements from the crew she'd hired. I knew it was time to take Margaret and her Pineview Heights HOA to court. This wasn't just about protecting my fortress anymore. It was about tearing down the oppressive system she'd built. I met Olivia the next day, bringing Blackthorn Haven's ownership papers, and video of the crew's destruction. "She's not just trespassing, Ethan," Olivia said, voice sharp. "These forged documents are proof of fraud, and if the Pineview Heights HOA knew and didn't stop her, they're liable too." I nodded, fists clenched. "I want her to pay, Olivia. I want Blackthorn Haven safe, and I want people like Helen and Tom free from her grip." Olivia smiled. "Then we'll sue Margaret and the HOA. Gear up. This'll be a big fight." Weeks later, I stood in the county courthouse, wearing my only suit, feeling both nervous and ready. Margaret sat across the room, out on bail, stone-faced beside Pineview Heights' pricey lawyers. Olivia opened by laying out the case from Margaret's first tablet-wielding visit, through the drone, the landscaping crew, to the vandalism and fake papers. She projected my camera footage on a big screen, showing the crew felling trees and breaking the fence. My voice booming. "You've got no right to touch a single brick here." The courtroom went silent, only the judge's sigh breaking it after the clip. I took the stand first. Facing Margaret, eyes locked, I didn't blink. Olivia asked me to recount everything, and I started. "I live at Blackthorn Haven, land my family's owned since my great-grandfather's time," I said, voice clear. Margaret Reynolds showed up, demanding I follow Pineview Heights rules, though I'm not part of their area. She flew a drone over my land, sent landscapers to cut my grass, and finally tore down my fence and trees with fake papers claiming I belong to them. "This is my fortress, and I own every brick here. I won't let anyone violate it. Margaret's lawyer, a lanky guy with glasses, tried to trip me up in cross-examination. Mr. Caldwell, don't you think your property negatively affects Pineview Heights' value? He asked, smirking. I shot back, I don't care what they think. Blackthorn Haven's private, and I keep it how I want. They've got no right to force rules on me. He sneered. But aren't you just a bad neighbor, refusing to cooperate? I leaned forward, voice firm. I'm not their neighbor. I'm a private landowner, and Margaret vandalized my property. That's not cooperation. That's breaking the law. Next, Olivia called Helen and Tom as witnesses. Helen, with silver hair and a shaky voice, told how Margaret fined her thousands for keeping cats, despite no clear rule. Tom, clutching his baseball cap, described Margaret's daily harassment over his truck, needed to support his kids. She made us live in fear, Tom said, facing the judge. But Ethan's the only one who stood up. Sitting there, I felt responsibility swell. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was for everyone. Margaret had crushed. Olivia brought in a property expert, Greg, a middle-aged guy, to dissect Margaret's fake papers. These documents are doctored, Greg said, pointing to the map on screen. Blackthorn Haven isn't part of Pineview Heights, and no permits allowed this destruction. Margaret's lawyers argued I had no standing to sue since I wasn't an HOA member, but Olivia crushed it. Margaret and the HOA harassed, trespassed, and defrauded to coerce Mr. Caldwell. She said, they're accountable. When Margaret took the stand, she strutted up, claiming she was protecting community value, and calling me a disruptor. But as Olivia presented the fake papers and video, she faltered, blaming the HOA. I didn't act alone, she stammered, voice cracking. The judge frowned, and I knew she was burying herself. After days of arguments, the jury returned a verdict. They sided with me on every count: trespassing, fraud, harassment. I got hefty damages for the fence and trees, but more crucially, they ruled the Pineview Heights HOA negligent for letting Margaret run wild. The judge ordered a full overhaul, appointing an independent auditor to oversee, and barred Margaret from any future role. As the ruling was read, I glanced at Margaret. She hung her head, her arrogance gone. Leaving the courtroom, Olivia clapped my shoulder. You won, Ethan. Blackthorn Haven's safe. I nodded, relief mixing with exhaustion, but I felt pride too. I stepped outside, sunlight hitting my face, recalling my last words on the stand. This is my fortress, and I own every brick here. Margaret wanted to break it, but I'd protected it. Not just for me, but for people like Helen and Tom. Margaret didn't just lose the case. She faced punishment for what she did to Blackthorn Haven. My fortress stood tall, and I guarded every brick. But what I didn't expect was how that victory rippled beyond me, shaking Pineview Heights to its core. In the days after the trial, I saw the fallout unfold, realizing I'd unintentionally become a catalyst for an entire community's change. Margaret got hit hard, not just with damages to me, but fines for fraud and trespassing. Word was, she had to sell her Pineview Heights house to cover it all, then quietly left the area, never seen around here again. The Pineview Heights HOA didn't escape either. The court-appointed auditor took over, and the old board was dissolved. A new one was elected, led by Tom, the single dad Margaret harassed over his truck. I ran into him at the grocery store days later, and he grabbed my hand, eyes shining. Ethan, because of you, we can breathe, he said. She's gone, and we're rebuilding. Pineview Heights started shifting fast. The petty rules Margaret enforced, like banning cats or trucks, were scrapped. The new HOA focused on real priorities: fixing roads, holding neighborhood cleanups, helping folks like Helen with mowing or repairs. I drove by once, saw kids playing in yards without fear of fines, and smiled. I never thought I'd impact them, but now it was clear. By defending Blackthorn Haven, I'd paved the way for them to break free of Margaret's yoke. One afternoon, as I repaired the fence Margaret's crew had smashed, Tom showed up at my iron gate. He wore a plain tee, holding a six-pack. Ethan, he called, voice warm. We're having our first community meeting with the new HOA tonight. No pressure to join. We know you're not Pineview Heights, but we'd love you to come say a few words. You made this happen. I hesitated, not big on crowds, but Tom's earnest look made me nod. All right, Tom, I'll be there. That night, I stepped into the Pineview Heights Community Center, feeling out of place among the crowd. But instead of wary stares, I got smiles and handshakes. Helen hugged me, whispering, "Thank you, Ethan. I can keep my cats without worrying now." Tom introduced me, and the room stood, clapping. I cleared my throat, stepped to the mic, feeling awkward, but speaking from the heart. "Thanks for welcoming me," I started. "I'm not part of Pineview Heights, but through this I've seen we're neighbors. I fought to protect Blackthorn Haven, my fortress, where I own every brick, but I'm glad it helped you reclaim your freedom too. The room nodded, some wiping tears. After the meeting, they invited me to stay for cake and chat. I listened as they shared stories of days free from fines over tall grass or parked cars. I heard the relief in their voices, and for the first time, I felt I wasn't just Blackthorn Haven's guardian. I'd sparked change for Pineview Heights. Weeks later I decided to build on that. I hosted a barbecue at Blackthorn Haven, inviting all of Pineview Heights. I swung the iron gate wide, letting them spread picnic blankets on the pasture and play catch by the pond. Helen brought cookies, Tom brought beer, and kids raced around the new pine I'd planted to replace the one Margaret felled. As the sun set I stood on the porch watching them laugh, feeling an odd joy. Blackthorn Haven was still my fortress, but now it bridged me to people I once thought strangers. Margaret had failed, but I hadn't. I didn't just save my land. I helped Pineview Heights transform because of me, and I was proud of that. After that first barbecue, I got used to Pineview Heights folks waving as they drove by. My fortress, where I owned every brick, wasn't just a hideaway anymore. It tied me to a neighborly bond I never saw coming. Margaret Reynolds was long gone, and I figured she'd never return. But one day, as I stood by the freshly painted iron gate, a familiar figure approached, and I realized I'd been wrong. Margaret stood a few yards off, a far cry from the haughty woman who'd once waved a tablet and screamed in my face. She wore a worn sweater, hair loosely tied, no trace of her old polish. I crossed my arms, watching her, waiting. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, voice soft, almost trembling. "I owe you an apology." I raised an eyebrow, silent, letting her go on. She took a deep breath, eyes on the ground. "What I did to you, to Blackthorn Haven, to Pineview Heights, it's unforgivable. I let power blind me, and I was wrong." I stood still, listening. This wasn't the Margaret I'd known, the one ready to tear down my fence and forge papers to win. She looked up, eyes glistening. "I grew up in a chaotic neighborhood, where no one cared. I thought if I controlled everything, I could make a better place. But I went too far. I'm sorry for wrecking your land, for hurting people. I know I can't fix it, but I want you to hear this." Her voice broke at the end, and I saw some sincerity there. I studied her a moment, recalling the days she sent crews in, the times she yelled I had to comply. But I also remembered Helen and Tom saying they were free because I stood up. I cleared my throat, stepping closer. "Thanks for the apology, Margaret," I said, voice even but not cold. "It means something. You did wrong, but I'm not one to hold grudges forever. I'm hosting a barbecue at Blackthorn Haven next week. You're welcome if you want to come." Margaret blinked, clearly stunned. She nodded slowly, a small smile breaking through. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. I'll be there. Thanks for giving me a chance." She turned, walking slowly to an old car parked down the road. I watched her go, feeling relief mixed with surprise. I didn't think I'd forgive her so easily, but standing there, in my fortress, I realized sometimes generosity was the best way to close a chapter. When Margaret Reynolds apologized, and I invited her to the barbecue, it felt like an old chapter shut for good. It became part of something bigger, a new community I never thought I'd belong to. One evening, I sat on the porch, watching the sunset gild the forest, reflecting on the journey that brought me here. The barbecue the next week went smoothly. I opened the iron gate, letting Pineview Heights folks flood the pasture with food and laughter. Helen brought cookies, Tom brought beer, and kids darted around the pond, playing under the new pine I'd planted. Margaret showed up, lingering quietly in a corner, but I saw her chatting with a few people, a shy smile on her face. I didn't say much to her, just nodded when she thanked me again. As everyone left, Tom clapped my shoulder. "Ethan, you gave us a fresh start," he said. I smiled, not replying, but inside, I knew it was true. I stood on the old lookout tower one day after, gazing down at Blackthorn Haven and Pineview Heights in the distance. Traffic between the two felt friendlier now. No wary looks, just waves. I thought of my great-grandfather, who built this fortress to shut out the world. He'd never guess I'd used it to build bridges instead of walls. Margaret once wanted to break it, but I'd saved it, and more, I'd made it a symbol of change. Blackthorn Haven was still mine, every brick my own, but it held new meaning. It wasn't just where I stood firm, it was where I helped others rise. As dusk faded I heard kids laughing in the distance, and I knew, though paper boundaries remained, in our hearts we'd become one community, stronger than ever. The story Karen, your HOA means nothing here. This is my fortress, and I own every brick. Mirrors real aspects of life in the US today. especially conflicts over property rights, HOA overreach, and the value of community unity. In it, Ethan Caldwell defends Blackthorn Haven, his private land, from Margaret Reynolds, who represents the Pineview Heights HOA. Margaret uses drones, construction crews, and fake papers to harass Ethan, reflecting a real U.S. issue, where some HOAs overstep, bothering residents with strict rules or illegal actions. The trial Ethan wins, forcing Pineview Heights to reform, shows the U.S. legal system remains a potent tool to protect individual rights when violated. The positive shift in Pineview Heights afterward, from oppression to friendliness, and Margaret's apology, paired with Ethan's barbecue, highlight the potential for healing and community building even after conflict. The takeaway for real life in the U.S. is this: stand firm for your rights, but stay open to improving the community around you. Ethan didn't just hold Blackthorn Haven by suing Margaret when she wrecked his fence and felled his pine. He freed Helen and Tom from HOA hassles, like fines for cats or parked trucks. It's a reminder that in a country valuing personal freedom like the U.S., standing against injustice, through law or dialogue, is vital. But Ethan's generosity in inviting Margaret to the barbecue shows forgiveness can turn foes into friends, much like Americans often seek reconciliation post-dispute. Learn from Ethan, guard your fortress, your home, rights, personal values, but don't forget a strong community grows from respect and cooperation, not just lines on paper. If you enjoyed the story of how I defended Blackthorn Haven and changed Pineview Heights, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more thrilling tales of defiance. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video, where we'll keep exploring stories of resilience and community.